They left, rode an elevator stack up through the levels of the Alcatraz station until they could see sky and water through the windows. It felt like pressure easing. On the upper balconies, Rovayo led him to a franchise outfit called Lima Alpha that had chairs and tables with views across the bay. She got heavily loaded pisco sours for them both, handed him his, and sank into the chair opposite with a fixed, speculative gaze. He sipped the cocktail, had to admit it was pretty good. His anger started to ebb. They talked about nothing much, drank, soaked in the late afternoon sunlight, slipped at some point from a Manglic into Spanish. Their postures eased, sank lower in their chairs. Neither of them made an obvious move. Finally, Rovayo's phone whittered for attention. She grimaced, hauled it out, and held it to her ear. Audio only. "Yeah, what?" She listened, grimaced again. "On my way home, why?" A male voice rinsed tinnily out of the phone, distant and indistinct. "Roy, I haven't been home in 30... No, wait." She checked her watch. 35 hours. I haven't slept in 12. And that was 90 minutes on the couch in operations." Crackled dispute. Rovayo glowered. "No, it fucking wasn't." Coyle crackled some more. She cut him off. "Look, don't try to tell me how much sleep I've had, Roy. You don't—" Spit, spit, crack. "Yeah, you're right. We are all tired. And when you're this fucking tired, Roy, you know what you do? You get some sleep. I'm not going to pull another macho all-nighter just so you can play at old-school cop with Tsai. Outside of all those pre-mill period flicks you love so much, nobody cracks a case like that. You guys want to act like the new math never fucking happened? Be my guest. I'm going home." A more muted crackling. Rovayo glanced across at Carl and raised an eyebrow. "No," she said flatly. "Haven't seen him. Doesn't he have a phone? No? Well, try his hotel, maybe. See you in the morning." She killed the call. "People are looking for you," she said. "Oh." "Yeah. You want to be found?" "Not particularly." "What I thought." She drained what was left in her glass and gave him the speculative look again. "Well, I'd say your hotel is a bust right now. Want another drink at my place?" He gave her back the look. "Is that a trick question?" Alcatraz Station ran smart chopper shuttles for its staff, 24/7 to both sides of the bay. The Oakland service dropped off at a couple of points within easy walk of Rovayo's apartment. They walked easily, pisco sours and the shared sense of truancy, laughing in the early evening air. She asked him how come he spoke Spanish. He told her a little about Marisol, a little more about Mars and the upland projects. As before, she seemed hungry for the detail. They touched, far more than her Hispanic background could write off as a cultural norm. Signals coming through clear and tight. They got up the stairs and in the door of her second-floor apartment, a couple of grins short of the clinch. The door swung shut behind them with a solid snap, and the burble of electronic security engaging. Their restraint shattered in hungry pieces on the floor. "So, what do you want to do now?" Still standing in front of him, hip shot, wide grin. Despite everything, he felt his sore and shrunken prick twitch at the sight. "I thought you were tired." She shrugged. "So did I. Cyclical, I guess. Give me another couple of hours, I probably will be again." "You're not extra-soming on me, are you?" "No, I'm not fucking extra-soming on you." Suddenly there was a real edge in her voice. "Do I look like I come from that kind of money? You think if my parents had the finance for built-in, I'd be working for Rimsec?" He blinked, held up his hands, palms out. Okay, it was just a thought. Rim states have got a reputation for that stuff, you know." She wasn't listening. She gestured at herself with one splayed hand, motion robbed of any sensuality by the look on her face. "What I've got, I was either born with or I fucking worked to build. I came up through the ranks. It's taken me 8 years to make detective, and I didn't take any fucking genetic shortcuts along the way. I didn't have—" "I said okay, detective." It stopped her. She sank back onto the sofa, sat hunched at the edge with her arms resting on her thighs, hands dangling into the space between. She lifted her head to look at him, and there was something hunted in her expression. "Sorry," she muttered. "We're all just a little fucking tired of the Asia Badawis and the Nicholson Hoangs around here." "Badawi's New York Sudanese," he pointed out. "Yeah? You want to see the house she's got down the coast? Lot of fucking acreage for a foreigner. Anyway, that's not what I meant." "No?" Suddenly the post-coital intimacy was too tight, like binding on his limbs and a masking film across his face. Rovio was abruptly the stranger she'd always been, but naked and in too close. He felt an unlooked-for visceral surge of nostalgia for sex with Sevgi Ertekin. "So you're not a big fan of enhancement generally, then?" She snorted. "You think anyone's a big fan of extrasomes that doesn't have them?" "I am," he said grimly. But he knew at base he was trying to provoke her. "You think I'd be in this fucking mess if they'd had working artificial chromosome technology for humans 40 years back? You think we'd be running around looking for some superannuated super-soldier-turned-cannibal fucking survivalist if 13 tendency could be platform-loaded and switched on and off at need? Take a good look at me, Rovio. I'm the walking fucking embodiment of last century's pre-extrasome jump-the-gun genetics." "I know." "I seriously doubt that." Carl lifted fingertips to his face, brushed at his cheekbones. "You see this? When you're a variant, people don't look at this. They go right through the skin, and all they see is what's written into your double helix." The rim cop shrugged. "Perhaps you'd prefer them to stop at the skin. What I hear about the old days? We're both the wrong color for that to be a better option. Would you really prefer it the way things were? A dose of good old-fashioned skin hate?" "Well, I already had my dose of that. I was banged up in a Jesus-land jail for the best part of 4 months, remember?" She widened her eyes. It made her look frighteningly young. Ertekin, he thought, would have just raised one quizzical eyebrow. "You did 4 months in there? I thought—" "Yeah, long story. Point is, you talk too easily about this shit, Rovio. Until you've lived inside a locked and modified gene code, you can't know what it's like. You can't know how happy you'd be to have an extrasome on-off switch to fall back on." "You don't think?" Rovio bent and swooped an arm to the floor beside the sofa, hooked up her discarded shirt and shouldered her way into it. Her eyes never left his face the whole time. It made him feel suddenly untrustworthy, an intruder into her home. She thumb-pressed the garment's static seam halfway closed, enough to pull it over her breasts and hide them. "What do you really know about me, Marsalis? I mean, really know?" He tasted the smart-mouth retorts on his tongue, swallowed them unspoken. Maybe she saw. "Yeah, I know we fucked. Please tell me you don't think that means anything." He gestured. "Well, I wasn't planning to propose." It got him a thin, unamused smile. "Yeah. Thing is, Marsalis," she sat back in the sofa, "I'm a bonobo." He stared. "No, you're fucking not." "No? What did you think? We're all sari-wrapped housewives or geisha bunnies? Or maybe you were expecting the giggly slut model, like that stupid fucking whore ranch they got down in Texas." "No, but I'm not full. My mother's the 100% deal. She used to work escort for a Panama agency, met my father when he was on a fishing trip down there. He smuggled her out." "Then you're not a bonobo." "Half of me is," said defiantly, jaw tight, eyes locked with his. "Read your Jacobson. Inherited traits will be an unknown factor for generations to come, quote unquote." Something happened to the room. A dense, deafening quiet sat behind her voice, washed in like a tide when she stopped talking. "Does Coyle know?" he asked, for something to break the stillness. "What do you think?" And quiet again. Finally her mouth crimped at one corner. "I don't know," she said slowly. "I look at what I am, the way I react to things, and then I look at her, and I just don't know. My old man tells me she never fit in down there. Never was submissive the way bonobos are supposed to be. He says that she was different from all the others. That's why he picked her out. I don't know whether to believe that shit or write it off to rose-tinted romantic fucking nostalgia. Carl thought back to the bonobos he'd seen in the transit camps in Kuwait and Iraq, the ones you couldn't get away from on R&R in Thailand and Sri Lanka. Some that he'd talked to, one or two he'd fucked. And back in London, Zuli's friend from the club, Kristalina, who always claimed she was but never showed him any proof that wasn't fan-site fantasy bullshit. I think, he said carefully, you don't want to confuse submissive with maternal or non-violent. Most of the bonobos I ever ran into knew how to get what they wanted about as well as anyone else. Yeah? Violence rose shimmering in her voice. I know how to give a pretty good blowjob myself, don't you think? That's not what I meant. You know what it feels like, Marsalis? Constantly testing your actions against some theory of how you think you might be supposed to behave? Wondering, every day at work, every time you make a compromise, every time you back up one of your male colleagues on reflex, wondering whether that's you or the gene code talking. A sour smile in Carl's direction. Every time you fuck, the guy you chose to fuck with, even the way you fuck him, all the things you do, the things you want to do, the things you want done to you. You know what it feels like to question all of that? All the time? He nodded. Of course I do. You just pretty much described where I live. I'm a good cop, she said urgently. You don't last in RIMSEC if you're not. I've shot and killed 3 men in the line of duty. I don't lose sleep over any of them. I mean, I got sick at the time, went through the counseling like everyone else, but after that I was fine. I've got commendations, early promotion to special cases, clearance rates that— Ravio, stop it. He held up a hand, surprised at how weary the sudden mirroring of his younger self in her was making him feel. I told you, I know. But you're going about this the wrong way. You don't have to justify yourself to anyone except you. In the end, that's all that matters. She smiled a hard, humourless smile again. Spoken like a true variant 13. Pretty obvious you've never had to face a genetic suitability assessor. I thought in the RIM. Yeah, RIM states citizens have a lot of rights that way. But citizen or not, I've still got my Jacobson license to live with. And before you say it, yes, that is confidential data, charter protected up the ass. But you waive your right to that protection when you sign up for RIMSEC. And Coyle still doesn't know about you? No. Assessment comes as part of the standard officer vetting procedure. There's no way for anyone to know I went through anything different from all the other grunts. Sign knows. He's my commanding officer. He'll have the file. And there are a few others at divisional level, the ones who were on the vetting committee. But it's more than any of their jobs are worth to let something like that leak. You think if Coyle knew he'd care? I don't know. You tell all your friends what you are? I'm a 13, he said with a straight face. We don't have any friends. She made the effort, laughed. There was some genuine amusement in it this time. That's why you're here? I'd have thought my reasons for being here were transparently obvious. Well, she tilted her head to one side. I guess you did explain yourself pretty thoroughly earlier, yeah. Thanks. Question remains, though. Her stance opened a little. She crossed one long ebony thigh over the other, bounced her foot up and down lightly at the end of the raised leg, and spread her arms cruciform along the back of the sofa. What do you want to do now? He smiled. Got an idea, he said. Chapter 36. Seen from the descending autocopter, Bulgakov's cat had the blunt, blocky look of a nighttime skyscraper chopped off across its base and floated lengthwise on the ocean. Lights festooned every segment of the factory raft's structure, studded its aerials and dishes, marked out landing pads and open-air sports arenas along the upper levels. Carl picked out a baseball diamond, a soccer pitch, a scattering of basketball courts, and softly underlit swimming pools, some half of which appeared to be in use. Like most of its floating sisters, the raft sold itself on being a 24-hour city, a pulsing engine of production, employment, and leisure whose reactor-powered heart never missed a beat. The publicity specs said she was home to 30,000 people, not including the tourists. Just looking down at her made Carl feel itchy and sociopathic. In the next seat, Alicia Rovaio yawned cavernously and shot him a sour look over her turned-up jacket collar. "I can't fucking believe I let you talk me into this." "You asked what I wanted to do." "Yeah." She leaned across his lap to peer out of the cabin port. "Not quite what I had in mind at the time." The autocopter swung closer, made a courtesy circuit before touchdown so its decals could be read by sight and not just by machines. Carl picked out individual figures on a basketball court, shadowed forms ploughing laps up and down in the tranquil, rippling lights of the pools. "Think of it as an intuitive leap," he said absently. "I'm thinking of it as a paranoid fantasy outing, which is exactly the way it's going to look when I have to write up the chopper time. I told you, Donaldson and Kodo came down here yesterday and talked to these people, got the interviews and the report on file. We're wasting our time. Long flight for nothing." "Yeah, that's something else you might want to think about. Cat there is still a couple of hundred clicks off optimum range for maintenance on Ward's spread. How come they rushed up here to do it now instead of waiting until next week?" "How the fuck would I know?" she grumbled. "Maybe if you'd accessed the file instead of insisting on coming down here personally, you'd already have an answer." "Yeah, I'd have an answer. I'd have whatever lie Dasky and Azul have decided to tell you to cover themselves. That's not what I want." Rovaio rolled her eyes. "Like I said, fucking paranoid." The autocopter found its designated landing pad, exchanged brief electronic chatter with the traffic management systems, and floated down to land with characteristic, inhuman perfection. The cabin hatch hinged open and Carl jumped down. Rovaio followed him, still mutinous. "Just don't break anything," she said. Daskin Azul had an unremarkable mall frontage somewhere amidships for direct client contact, and a couple of elevator-served workshops down in the hull where they kept the submarine hardware. They subcontracted landing pad time and aircraft support through a secondary provider, but had their own surface and sub-vessels moored in dry dock aft and starboard. This much Rovaio could tell him off the top of her head, detail skimmed from what she remembered of Donaldson and Kodo's briefing. There was more in the file, and in theory they could have requested it via the autocopter's datahead, but the Rimcop seemed disinclined to use the machine systems more than they already were, was already, it seemed, regretting the way they'd requisitioned the transport with her special cases badge, and Carl didn't much care one way or the other. He had more than enough to work with. So they flagged their business aboard Bulgakov's Cat as simple follow-up investigation, which the autocopter told the factory raft's datahead, and the RIM security protocols did the rest. Technically, vessels like the Cat were autonomous nation-states, but any nation-state that lived so solidly from niche entry into the hyperdynamic RIM state's economy had to live with the political realities the relationship entailed. Bulgakov's Cat cruised freely in and out of the RIM's coastal jurisdiction. Its citizens had right of access to RIM state's soil. Its contracts were legally enforceable in RIM courts, but it all came at a stiff colonial price. Rovaio led Carl along the promenades and corridors of the factory raft with a proprietorial lack of self-consciousness and an authorized loaded gun beneath her jacket. They might have been taking a stroll inside Alcatraz station for all the tension she showed. They'd spoken to no one when they came aboard, notified no one, taken no courtesy measures whatsoever at a human level. Somewhere in the walls the machines whispered to one another about them in incomprehensible electronic tones, but beyond that they came on Dasky and Azul unannounced. "And at this time of night," the Daskin Azul front desk agent complained with barely disguised irritation. "I mean, our usual hours of business." "Are not my problem," Rovaio told him crisply. "We're here to follow up on a RIMSEC murder investigation, and the last I heard, Bulgakov's Cat was a 24-hour service community. You've seen my ID, so how about you roll out some of that 24-hour service and answer my questions?" The agent switched his eyes to Carl. "And he is—" "Getting impatient," Carl said impassively. "I've seen no ID," the agent insisted. Below the smooth upper shelf of the reception desk, his hands were busy pressing buttons. "I'd have to see ID for both of you." Rovaio leaned on the shelf. "Did your mother get you this job?" she asked curiously. The agent gaped at her, belated anger dropping his jaw for a retort he wasn't fast enough to make. "Because it appears to be a job you don't feel any pressing need to do properly. This man is a private consultant for RIM Security, and his liaison is with me, not you. I've shown you my fucking ID, Sonny, and in about another 10 seconds I'm going to be showing you the front end of a RIMSec probable cause shutdown order. Now either you're going to answer my questions, or you're going to get someone better paid out of bed to do it for you. I don't much care either way. So which is it going to be?" The man behind the desk flinched as if slapped. "I'll just see," he muttered, prodding more buttons on the screens beneath his hands. Just have a seat." "Thank you," said Rovaio, with heavy irony. They folded themselves into the utilitarian bank of chairs opposite the desk. The reception agent fit a phone hook to his ear, muttered into it. Outside, on the broad sweep of the mall, a thin but unending nighttime herd of shoppers browsed past the open storefronts, clothing bright, gait unhurried and undirected, like sleepwalkers or the victims of some multiple hypnotic trick. Carl sat and tried, the way Sutherland had taught him, not to feel the usual seeping contempt. It wasn't easy. "On Mars." "Yeah, like fuck." "On Mars, things are different because they have to be, Soak." Lopsided grin, like he was giving away some secret he shouldn't. "But that's strictly temporary. No more long-term truth in it than all that bullshit they sell in the Qualpro ads. Day's going to come, this place'll be just like home, only less gravity. It's them, Carl. It's the humans. Take 'em wherever and give 'em time, they'll build you the same fairy fucking playground as ever was. And that's the construct you got to live inside, Soak. Like it, or like it not." A slim, elegantly dressed woman emerged from an inner door behind the front desk. Tailored jacket and slacks in olive green and black, just a chic hint of work coveralls about the ensemble. Striking looks, strong on Chinese genes but salted with something else. She leaned down beside the reception agent, spoke briefly in low tones, then looked up again. Carl met her eyes from across the room and saw a depth of calm there that told him they'd just gone up an entire level. He saw something that might have been an acknowledgment in the return gaze. Then the woman straightened up and came around the side of the desk toward them. She walked like a dancer, like a combat pro. Carl came to his feet on automatic, the way he would have if someone in the room had pulled a gun. The new arrival saw it and smiled a little. It hit him secondarily, riding in past the wave of caution, that she was very beautiful in that rim-blended Asia-Pacific fashion you saw in Freeport movie stars and major female political figures up and down the West Coast. She put out her hand, offered to Carl first. The grip and the look that backed it up were both coolly evaluative. Shaking hands with Rovaio was strictly a side issue, a formality dealt with and then set aside. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Carmen Wren, Assistant Duty Manager. I must apologize for the way you've been received. We're all still a little shaken from our discovery up at Ward Biosupply. But of course, we want to cooperate fully with the investigation. Please come with me." She led them back through the door she'd used, through cramped storage space racked with shelves of underwater equipment and other less identifiable hardware. On the far side of one sparsely loaded freestanding unit, Carl glimpsed 2 commercial-size elevator hatches set into a side wall. A faint sea salt dampness hung about in the air. At the back, the storeroom had another door that opened into an office cubicle where Carmen Wren gestured them to the 2 visible chairs and pulled down a third, folding seat from the wall. They sat with knees almost touching. The Chinese woman looked back and forth between them. "So then," she said brightly, "I'd been given to understand that your colleagues had all the information they needed. but clearly that's not the case. So what is it I can do for you?" Ravio looked over at Carl and nodded with ironic largesse. She was still visibly fuming from their reception at the front desk and the subtle relegation Wren had dealt her. Carl shrugged and stepped up. "Ward Biosupplies fields are a good 200 kilometres northwest of here," he said. "Nearer 300 when you went up there 2 days ago. You mind telling us why you didn't hold off until the cat got a little closer?" "Well," Carmen Wren gestured apologetically, "I wasn't the duty manager for that shift, so it's not a question I can answer fully. But we quite often do attend to a contract ahead of time that way. It depends more on staffing rotations, hardware overhaul, that kind of thing, than actual proximity. As you'll probably know from our promotional literature, Daskin Azul has an operational deployment radius of up to 500 kilometers should the need arise." "And the need arose here?" "So it appears, yes. Though, as I said—" Ravio joined the play. "Yeah, you weren't on duty. We heard you. So who was?" "I would really need to check the duty logs to be certain." A hint of reproach tinged Wren's voice. "But I'm reasonably sure that the officers who visited us yesterday will already have that information." Carl ignored the significant look he was getting from Ravio. "I'm not concerned with what you told Donaldson and Kodo," he said bluntly. "I'm looking for Alan Merrin." Wren frowned. Genuine puzzlement or immaculate control. "Alan?" "Merrin," said Ravio. "Alan Merrin." Wren nodded seriously, kept to the slightly vowel-heavy mispronunciation of the first name. "I'm afraid we don't have an employee of that name. Or a client, as far as I'm aware. I could—" Carl smiled. "I'm not a policeman, Wren. Don't make that mistake with me. I'm here for Merrin. If you don't give him up, I'll go through you to get him. Your choice, but one way or another it's going to get done. He can skulk about America, hiding in the crowd like a cudlip if he wants, but it isn't going to save him. This game is over. Next time you hear from him, you can tell him that from me." Wren let go a small, sliding breath, the sound of politeness embarrassed. "And you are, exactly?" "Who I am isn't very important. You can call me Marsalis if it matters. What I am, well," he watched her face closely, "I'm a Variant 13, just like your pal Merrin. You can tell him that too, if you like." A defensive smile hesitated at the corners of the woman's mouth. Her eyes slipped sideways to Ravio, as if in appeal. "I'm afraid I really don't know who you're referring to with this Merrin. And, Detective Ravio, I have to say that your colleague here is being considerably less well-mannered than the 2 officers who preceded you." "He's not my colleague," said Ravio indifferently, "and I don't think he's that bothered about manners either. I'd start cooperating if I were you." "We are already cooperating fully with—" "You put into Lima on your way up here?" Carl asked her. "Right?" This time he thought the frown was genuine. "Bulgakov's cat very rarely puts in, as you express it, anywhere. We are dry-docked in the Angeline Freeport on average every 5 years, but otherwise—" "I'm not talking about the cat. I'm talking about Daskin Azul. You got friends on the Peruvian coast, right?" "I personally do not. No. But it may be that some of our employees do. Bulgakov's cat is, as I'm sure you're aware, licensed for the whole of the Pacific America's rim, and Daskin Azul certainly has contracts along the Peruvian segment, as do many of our fellow companies aboard. But this, all of this, is common knowledge. You could have ascertained it using any corporate commerce register for the region." "Seen Manco Bambaren recently? Or Greta Jurgens?" Another elegant furrowing of the clean white brow, lips pursed, regretful shaking of the head, her long glossy hair shifted in sheaves. "I'm sorry. These names, none of them is familiar to me, and I'm still not clear exactly what, if anything, you are accusing us of." "What are they paying you, Wren?" Pause. The brief smile again. I really don't think, Mr. Marsalis, that my salary is any of your... No, really. Give it some thought, Wren. I think the people I represent would make it worth your while to turn. And this is coming down around you anyway. We don't have enough yet, but we will. And when Merrin breaks cover, I'll be there. You don't want to get caught in that particular crossfire. Believe me. Are you trying to scare me, Mr. Marsalis? No. I'm appealing to your sense of reality. I don't think you scare easily, Wren. But in the end, I think you're smart enough to recognize when it's time to cut cable and bounce. He held her gaze. That time is now. The polite, sliding breath sound again. I don't really know how to respond to that. You're attempting to bribe me? Another shuttled glance at Revaio. Into what, exactly? Is this standard RIMSEC procedure these days? I already told you I'm not a cop, Wren. I'm just like you. For hire and... Wren shot to her feet, clean and rapid motion, no leverage with either arm on the furniture around her. In the confined office space it was a remarkable piece of physical precision. She brought loosely cupped fists together at her chest, a formal stance that echoed dojo training. That's it, she flared. This conversation is over. I have been as cooperative as possible, Detective Revaio, and all I have received in return are innuendo and insult. I will not be compared to some variant in this way. Take your offensive, genetically enhanced friend and get out. If you wish to speak to me again, you will contact our legal representatives. Think that was for real? Revaio asked him as they walked back to the landing pad. She was still fingering the tiny lawyer's card Wren had handed her. Carl shook his head. She wanted us out of there, and she hooked the best opportunity there was to shut us down fast. Yeah, what I thought. If she's a Daskin Azul duty manager, then I'm a fucking bonobo. You see the moves on her? Revaio nodded reluctantly. Still think I'm paranoid? I think you... And out of nowhere, a corner in the mall, shoppers still around them, out of the fractured crowd, out of the sweet piped music and murmur, suddenly a panicked bystander screamed. And then the figure leaped, tall and lean, distorted face around the gut-deep yell, eyes blown wide with hate, and gun-metal glint of the machete hacking down. Chapter 37. Scott Osborne had seen and heard enough. Nearly 5 months of sitting on his hands, waiting because Carmen told him that was how it had to be. Months while Bulgakov's cat churned up and down the coast of the Americas, coastline always out of sight, just below the horizon, like the harrowing that Carmen had promised was to come but hadn't still. Months adrift. Scott had never seen the ocean for real before he came to the rim, and living afloat in the middle of it, week after landless week, didn't seem natural. Never would. He bore it because he must, and because when Carmen came to him it all seemed worth it. Lying with her afterward, he seemed to feel the approaching storm, and to accept it with the same comfortable ache he'd felt that last summer before he left for Bozeman and the fence run. It was the sense of your time running out, and the sudden value in everything you'd ordinarily take for granted, everything that would soon be swept away. But the storm never came. Instead, they waited. And life aboard the factory raft took on the same dismal proportions as life anywhere else you tried to survive that wasn't home. He hung around Daskin Azul, looking for things to do and taking on whatever work they'd give him. He kept out of the stranger's way, even now that he'd learned to call him Merrin, now that his knees no longer trembled when he looked into the hollow eyes. And he didn't ask when Merrin and Carmen disappeared together for long periods of time. But something was happening to the exhilaration he'd felt on the deserted airfield all those months ago, and it was something bad. He didn't want to believe it was lack of faith. Not again. He prayed, more now than he ever had even back home, and what he prayed for mostly was guidance, because what had seemed so clear back at the airfield with his head still bandaged and the fear fresh in his heart was slowly but surely giving way to a mess of conflicting voices in that self-same head and heart. He knew the judgment was at hand, had at first derived an almost smug superiority among the other workers and shoppers aboard the Cat as he watched them living out what were probably the last months of their lives in ignorance, but that was fading fast. Now that same blissful ignorance rubbed at him like a badly fitting boot, irritated something deep inside that made him want to grab them by the throat as they browsed sheep-like through the glittery-lit glass storefronts of the mall, or sat on a break in the bowels of Bulgakov's Cat, guffawing and barking like subnormals about what they'd give that slinky bitch Asia Badawi if they ever got in the elevator with her. He wanted to choke them, slap them, smash down their idiot complacency, scream into their faces, "Don't you understand? It's time! He is coming, don't you see? You will be weighed in the balance and found wanting." He forced it down, deeper inside him, prayed for patience, talked to Carmen. But these days even Carmen was not the refuge she had once been. When they slept together now, he sometimes felt an impatience smoking off her in the act, as if he were some awkward tangle of weed around a marker boy on the Ward estates. She'd snapped at him a couple of times post-coital, apologized immediately, of course, told him she was sorry, she was tired. Yes, she was tired of waiting too, but that was the way it had to be. It was a hard path for the righteous. And there was Merrin. Now the terror of precarious faith came sweeping in for real, up along his arms, lifting the hair with a ghost caress. It pricked out sweat on his palms and swathed him in a cool dread like standing over a precipice. What if he was wrong? What if Carmen was wrong? What if they all were? Merrin was out of sight so much, Scott had no way of knowing what he did with his time. But when he was there, it didn't feel like the presence of a saviour, or the King of Heaven come again in triumph. It was more like sharing V-time with a stripped protocol face, one of the bare-bones chassis models you could buy off the rack and customize the way those kids he'd once shared a flop with in the Freeport were always doing. Merrin spoke little, answered questions even less, sat mostly wrapped in his own silence and staring out at the sea from whatever vantage point there was. It was like he'd never seen the ocean before either, and for a while that gave Scott a warm feeling of kinship with the other man. He thought it might mean he could be a more worthy disciple. Of course, he knew to leave Merrin alone. Carmen had been clear on that, if on nothing else. But every now and then, in the tight corridors and storage spaces of Daskin Azul, he caught the stranger's eye, and the returned gaze did nothing but chill him. And he never told Carmen, didn't dare tell her, about the time he'd come up behind Merrin at one of his ocean vigils and said, in as steady and respectful voice as he could manage, "Yeah, it got me that way when I first saw it, too. Just didn't seem possible. That much water in one place." And Merrin whipped around on him like some bar tough whose drink he'd just spilled, only faster. So much inhumanly faster. And said nothing. Nothing at all. Just glared at him with the same blank unkindness in those eyes that Nocera had sometimes had, the same, but not. Because this time there was something in the eyes so deep, so cold, so distant, that whatever else Scott believed about this man, he knew for certain that what Carmen Wren had told him was true, that Merrin really had come here across a gulf that nothing human could cross unprotected. He looked back into those eyes for the scant seconds he could bear to, and he felt the cold of it blowing over him, as if Merrin's gaze were an open door into the void he'd crossed to get here. Scott winced. He turned away, mumbling half-formed apologies. He moved like a snake. Walking away, he heard Merrin say something that sounded like "cunt lips." Knew it couldn't be those words, tried to put the encounter out of his mind. But the way the stranger had turned on him, the whiplash speed and venom of it would not go away. "He moves like a snake," ran in his thoughts like dripping poison. He could not reconcile it with what he wanted to believe. "Judgment means what it says," Pastor William had always warned them. "You think the Lord is going to come like some bleeding-heart UN liberal and make us all love one another? No, sir. He will come in judgment and vengeance for those who defile his gifts, like it says in the good book itself," the big, black, limp-cover Bible brandished aloft. "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I am not come to send peace, but a sword. Yes, sir. When the Lord comes, he will be wrathful, and those who have not walked in righteousness will know the terror of his justice." Terror Scott could accept, could understand. But should the Saviour of mankind really move like a snake? Questions and doubts, coiling back and forth in his head, and Carmen withdrawing, cooler now with every time they lay together, drifting away from him. There'd been times recently when she simply didn't want him, shrugged him off, made excuses that convinced him less and less. He could see the time coming when... And then, instead, the black man came. "You stay out of it," Carmen snapped at him as she threw on clothes. "You don't make a move unless I call it, right?" At the door of the tiny lower-deck apartment she turned back, softened her voice with an effort he saw on her face. "Sorry, Scott. It's just, you know how hard this is for all of us. Just let me handle it. It'll be fine." So he watched on the monitors instead, and he saw the black man for himself, no doubt in his mind any more. He felt the thud of certainty in his blood. The black man, betraying himself in his arrogance. "I'm not a policeman, Wren. Don't make that mistake with me. I'm here for Merrin. If you don't give him up, I'll go through you to get him. Your choice, but one way or another it's going to get done." Scott felt his previous confusion shrivel away. Regained conviction was a solid joy in his throat, a pulsing in his limbs. And Carmen, showing no fear, his heart swelled with love and pride for her, but he knew the terror she must feel, there alone, facing the darkness. Carmen, brave enough to keep silent in the face of the black man's threats, to stand his presence, but not strong enough to do what needed to be done. "We have a part to play in this, Scott. You have a part." And now he knew what it was. The machete was cling-padded to a panel under the bed. He hadn't told Carmen, but he'd seen how it might come down. The enemy smashing in the door like the faceless, helmeted UN police in End Times Volume 1, Issue 56, dragging them naked and defenseless from the bed. He wouldn't go that way. He dressed, pulled on a mid-length deck coat with Daskin Azul logos across back and sleeves. He freed the machete from its cling pads, tucked it under the coat, under one arm. Checked himself in the mirror, and saw that it worked. Not enough to get past any kind of door with security on it, but in the incessant crowds of the shopping decks, more than enough to let him get close. The rest was in God's hands. He looked into the mirror, saw the taut determination his face threw back, and for just a moment it was as if it was him, Merrin, looking out from behind Scott's eyes, lending him the force of will he'd need. Scott murmured a swift prayer of thanks and walked out to face the black man. It was like the fucking Saudi ops dog all over again, like Dudek and the Aryans. Carl saw the eyes, locked with them on instinct, and it was the same blank, driven hatred that filled them. Who the fuck? No time. The machete swung down. His attacker was a big guy, tall and reachy. The response wrote itself. Carl hurled himself forward inside the chopping arc, blocked and stamped, took the fight to the ground. Against all expectation, the other man flailed like an upturned beetle. Carl got in with an elbow, stunning blow to the face, Tanindo grasp on the machete arm, twist, and the weapon clattered free. A knee came up and caught him in the groin, not full force, but enough to half-kill his strength. The other man was screaming at him, weird invective and what sounded like religious invocation. Hands came, clawing for his throat. It was no kind of fighting Carl knew. He fended, expecting a trick. got feeble repetition instead. He did the obvious thing, grabbed a finger and snapped it sideways. The invocation broke on a scream. Another long leg lashed at him, but he smothered it, kept hold of the snapped finger, twisted some more. His attacker screamed again, quivered like a gaffed fish. Carl had time to look down into the eyes again, saw no surrender there. He chopped down into the side of the throat, pulled it a little at the last moment. He'd need to talk to this guy. The fight died. Ravio circled in, gun drawn, levelled on the unmoving figure on the floor. Carl grunted around the ache in his balls, shot the pistol an ironic glance. "Thanks. Little late for that." "Is he dead?" "Not yet." Carl levered himself to his feet, groaned again, glanced around. The gathered crowd gaped back. "Just him, huh?" "Looks that way." Ravio hauled an arm aloft, showed the hollow in her palm to the spectators. "Rimsec," she stated it like a challenge. "Anyone work security around here?" Hesitation. Then a thick-set uniform with blunt Samoan features shouldered his way through the others. "I do." "Good, you're deputized." She read the name off his chest ID. "Suanyu. Call this in, get some backup. The rest of you, give me some space." On the floor, Carl's attacker coughed and flopped. They all looked. Carl saw suddenly that he was young, younger even than Dudek had been, barely out of his teens. He cast about and saw a cluster of carbon fibre chairs and tables around a sushi counter that had closed for the night. He hauled the boy up by the lapels and dragged him toward the nearest chair. The crowd skittered back out of his path. The boy's eyes fluttered. Carl dumped him into the chair, settled him there, and slapped him hard across the face. "Name?" The boy gagged, tried to rub at his neck where Carl's stunning chop had gone home. The black man slapped him again. "Name," he said again. "You can't do that," said a woman's voice from the crowd, Australian twang to it. Carl turned his head, found her with a narrow look. Elegant, olive-skinned shopper, early 50s, stick-thin. A couple of bags, ochre and green parcels, black cord handles, flicker at for some franchise or other across the ochre in black Thai script. His lip curled. "Haven't you got some shoes to go by?" "Fuck you, buddy." She wasn't backing down. "This isn't the Rim. You can't walk all over us like this." "Thanks. I'll bear that in mind." Carl went back to the boy in the chair, backhanded him and got blood. "Name?" "Marsalis." Ravio was at his side. "That's enough." "You think?" Her voice dropped to a mutter. "She's right. This isn't the Rim. There's only so far we can push this." Carl looked around. The Samoan security guard was talking into a phone, but his eyes were fixed on the boy and the black man standing over him. And the crowd had shuffled back when Ravio ordered them to, but beyond that they were staying put. Carl guessed maybe 1 in 10 had actually seen the fight, even less the machete attack that preceded it. The scenario was wide open for interpretation. He shrugged. "You've got the gun." "Yeah, I do. And I'm not about to start shooting these people with it." "I don't think it'd come to that." "Marsalis, forget it. I'm not—" Spluttering cough. The boy in the chair floundered there, grasping the carbon weave arms. His gaze was locked on Carl's face. "Black man," he spat. Carl glanced sideways at Ravio. "Observant little fucker, isn't he?" The Rim cop grimaced and put herself between Carl and the chair. She showed the Rimsec hollow to the boy. "See that? Do you know how much trouble you're in, son?" The boy glared back at her. "I know you lie for him. Authority out of Babylon, and black lies that shield the servants of Satan. I know who your master is." "Oh, great." "Marsalis, shut up a minute." Ravio closed her hand, stowed her gun, and scrutinized their prisoner with hands on hips. "You're from Jesus land, right? You're a fence hopper. You got any idea how quickly I can have you sent back there?" "I do not answer to your laws. I do not bow down before Mammon and Belial. I have been chosen." In the crystalline lighting of the mall, the boy's face was pale and slick with sweat. "I have gone beyond." "You certainly have," said Carl wearily. "Marsalis!" "Hey, he didn't come at you with a fucking machete." The boy tried to stand. Rovaio stiff-armed him impatiently in the chest, sent the chair skidding back a little as he collapsed back into it. "Sit down," she advised him. Rage detonated in his eyes. His voice scaled upward. "You are false judges, false lawgivers, money changers, sunk in stinking sins of flesh and corruption." It was as if he were vomiting up something long suppressed. "You will not lead me astray. You will not You want me to shut him up?" "Vale, I am beyond your traps. Judgment—" "No, I fucking don't. I want—" "Is coming. He is here. He lives in the flesh among us. You know him as Merin, but you know nothing. He is—" The tirade ebbed a little, lost some of its shrill rage as Carl and Rovaio both stared down at the boy with fresh interest. "The commander of the legions of heaven," he finished uncertainly. "Merin's here?" jerked out of Carl. "Aboard the cat? Now?" The boy's lips tightened. Carl switched gazes to Rovaio. She reached for her phone. "Can you lock this place down?" "On it." She was already dialing. She put the phone to her ear, looked at him as she listened. "Alcatraz can authorize a block on traffic in and out. Might have to get a couple of people out of bed to do it, but—" The phone crickled audibly with scrambler protocols and then a voice. Rovaio cut across it. "Alicia Rovaio, special cases. Print me and then get me the Alcatraz duty officer." Pause. Very deliberately, Carl turned his back on the boy in the chair. Casually, he asked, "Is that going to be satellite enforceable?" Rovaio nodded. "There's bound to be something overhead. One of ours, or something we can rent the time on. Special cases can usually—" "Hello? Yeah, this is Rovaio. Listen." "Hey, no!" Carl didn't really need the anonymous yell. Tanindo, as taught by Sutherland, worked up a high level of proximity sense, and the mesh tuned it tighter still. He felt the boy come out of the chair without needing to turn and see it. He turned anyway, at a leisurely rate, and caught the escape bid with peripheral glimpse, the same peeled awareness that had saved him from the machete attack in the first place. The boy was already out of tackle range, heading for the refuge of a side-access walkway, pumping limbs, head thrown back, a spurt of desperate speed. Not bad, all things considered. He saw Rovaio stiffen, stop speaking to Alcatraz, reach for her stowed gun. He put out an arm to forestall her, shook his head. "Let him go. I'm on it." "But you—" "Relax. Running after idiots is what I do for a living." He turned away. Would have liked the gun, but it wasn't like there was time to talk it through. "He's getting away!" shouted the Australian woman. Carl spared her a murderous look, then he was in motion. Slow run building to a sprint, gathering speed and purpose, the fine focal intensity of the hunt. Time to find Merin and shut him down. Chapter 38. Wide awake, jet-lagged to pieces even the sin didn't seem able to fix, she sat in the window of the hotel room and stared out over the bay. Colin privileges, top-floor suite, unobstructed views. The marching lights of the Bay Bridge led her gaze inexorably across to where Oakland's own nighttime display glowed from the waterline and twinkled up into the hills. Cheap fucking piece of shit. Norton wanted to put out a citywide search and detain, but neither she nor Coyle was interested. They both knew damn well where Marsalis was, and the fact that he was technically absent without authorization was the least of it. Rovaio wasn't answering her phone, and what that meant was punched onto the other rim cop's face like bruising from a street fight. Sevgi couldn't be sure if Coyle and Rovaio had ever been an item as such, but they were partners, and most of the time that ran deeper. Higher loyalty stakes. The people you accepted into your bed weren't likely to have to save your life on any given day. Back with NYPD, Sevgi had her share of ill-advised co-worker liaisons, but she never crossed that particular line with anybody she partnered, not because she hadn't occasionally been tempted, but because it would have been stupid. like taking one of Harbour Patrol's big powerboats into the shallow waters off some white sand tourist beach. You just knew that you were going to stick and tip. "Not like now, huh, Sev?" the Sin sneered at her. "This one you got well under control, don't you? Deep water and an even keel all the way." "Oh, shut up." She wasn't sure how long she had been sitting there, disconnected into the sprinkle-lit night, when someone started hammering on the door. "Sevgi!" She blinked. It was Norton's voice, muffled through the soundproofing on the door and slightly slurred. They'd sat up in the hotel bar for a while earlier, barely touched drinks and not much to say. At least she thought the drinks were barely touched, until, out of nowhere, he said to her quietly, "Just like cocaine, right? No evolved defenses. Too much strain on your heart." She stared back at him, aware that he'd nailed her somehow, but unable to make exact, rational sense of the words. "I don't know what you're thinking about, Tom," she answered stiffly. "But I'm sitting here thinking about Helena Larson, and how we still haven't caught the motherfucker who murdered her." It was only halfway to a lie. The promises she'd made to herself and the mutilated corpse back in June weighed heavily whenever she gave them headroom. So she'd fled the bar, left Norton sitting there with a brief good night. Now it seemed he'd stayed for the long haul. "Sev? You in there?" She sighed and levered herself off the window shelf to the floor, padded across to the door and opened it. Norton leaned on the doorframe with one raised arm, not as drunk as she'd feared. "Yeah, I'm in here," she said. "What's going on?" He grinned. "This you are going to love. Coyle just called." "Yeah?" She turned away, left the door open. "Come on in. So what happened? He stormed over to Ravio's place and dragged Marsalis out of her bed?" "No, not quite." Norton followed her in, waited until she turned back to face him. He was still grinning. She folded her arms. "So?" "So Ravio and Marsalis stormed Bulgakov's cat this evening, bullied their way into Dasky Nazul's offices and made a mess. Someone took exception and came at Marsalis with a machete." "What?" "That's right. Now Ravio's called a rimsec lockdown on the whole raft, and Marsalis is somewhere down in the belly of the beast chasing the machete artist because he thinks it's all part of some grand conspiracy that'll lead him to Marin." "Oh, you've got to be fucking kidding me." "I wish I were." "Well, where's Coyle?" "On his way here now. He's heading out to the party with a detachment of Rimsec's public order thugs in tow. I sort of insisted he stop by and pick us up." Sevgi grabbed her jacket off the bed and shouldered her way into it. "Would have settled for him just fucking her," she muttered, then suddenly remembered she was no longer alone. Norton pretended not to hear. In the bowels of Bulgakov's cat, Karl found a curious relief. There were at least no fucking stores down here. His short-term memory spilled recall of endless, smooth-floored, covered thoroughfares and changing frontages in such volume that their individuality finally blurred into perceptible patterns of appeal. Clothing under glass, museum exhibit sober or in shout-out garish display, depending on the prey it was designed to hook. Little chunks and slices of hardware under soft, gleaming lights. Food and drink laid out in hollow-reel, impressionistic tumbles of plenty designed to imitate some ghost memory of a street market. Psychochemicals blown up in hollow display to sizes where pills and the molecules they were made of each started to resemble the fetishized pieces in the hardware shops. Services and intangibles sold with broad cinematic images that offered almost no intelligible connection with the product. Level after level after level of it. Walkway after walkway, maze of corridors, of elevators and staircases, all bright and endless. He tuned it out and chased the machete boy, as close as the sparse nighttime crowds would allow. He'd long ago learned that when the untrained are chased, they look back a lot in the early stages of the pursuit, but rapidly gain confidence if no pursuer is readily apparent. He supposed it was evolved tendency. If the big predator doesn't get you in the first few minutes, you're probably clear. In any event, the trick was to hang back and let your quarry build up that confidence, then tighten up and follow until they take you where you want to go. It rarely failed. Of course, he would have liked more cover. The late shoppers were a thin crowd, and to make matters worse, a typical rim mix, which meant black or white faces were a lot less common than Asian or Hispanic. And the boy with a machete seemed curiously fixated on Carl's skin color. That might just have been standard, antiquated race hate. The boy was, after all, from Jesus land and spouting religious gibberish to match, so anything was possible. But even if it wasn't, Machete Boy would be looking back for a black face, and there weren't that many in the crowd. Carl needed him to see a few, suffer the jolt drop of terror, and then the relief as he wrote the sighting off. The more times that happened, the more the boy's adrenal response to a black face was going to decay, and the more he'd relax. He hung back. He used the mirrored surfaces, the camera playback and display narcissism of the mall space, and he watched as his quarry's frantic, spinning, backward-staring run damped down to a slower, purposeful threading through the crowd. The full-body turns became frequent over-the-shoulder glances, and then not so frequent. Carl eased forward, keeping behind knots of shoppers and going bent-kneed where there was no one tall enough to give him cover. Then the stores ran out. They'd been dropping levels slowly but steadily, taking gleaming marbled stairways and the odd gleaming jewel-box elevator all consistently downward. At first Carl thought they might be heading back to Dasky and Azul, but they'd already gone too low for that, and he didn't think the boy had the skills or presence of mind to lay a double back track. In the frontages, prices came down. Empty rental space began to interpose itself between the taken units. The holodisplays got ragged, the merchandise and the way it was sold took on an imitative quality, a not quite good copy of what the upper decks carried. The services on offer became less wholesome, or at least less smoothly packaged. Kill Bitch Available, he saw in cheap neon, wasn't sure what it referred to, wasn't sure he wanted to. Elsewhere, someone had spray-canned a huge empty rectangle on the glass front of an untenanted unit and filled it with the words, "Buy, consume, die." Artwork to follow. No one had cleaned it off. The boy flickered left out of the flow of shoppers and took another staircase. This time it was a utilitarian, unpolished metal affair, and no one else was using it. When Carl got to it, he could hear his quarry's steps clattering down in the well. Fuck. He waited until the metallic footfalls stopped, then went down after them, trying to make as little noise as possible. At the bottom of the well he found himself in a low-rent residential section, simple green security doors set in bleak grey corridor walls, whose ragged graffiti scars were almost a relief. A steady thrum in the structure suggested heavy-duty engines somewhere close. The floor was dirty, stains and patches of dust that crunched underfoot, neat lines of detritus swept to the sides either by mechanical cleaning carts or possibly the residents themselves working manually. Clear evidence, if he'd been in need of it, that the nano-hygiene systems didn't make it down here much. Nor, he supposed, did anyone else who didn't either live here or know someone who did. Which, of course, made it perfect for Merrin. The corridor was deserted. Receding rows of closed doors and no sign of Machete Boy anywhere. Branch corridors up ahead to left and right, the same story again when he reached them and peered down the dingy perspectives they offered. Meshed up tension sagging slowly into the realization that his quarry had gone to ground. He held off the settling feeling as best he could, prowled down the left-hand branch passage, ears tuned past the engine thrum for the sound of voices or footsteps. Well aware, I fucking know, that the doors would have security cameras and that each one he passed upped the risk of being spotted if his quarry was in one of the apartments behind watching the screen. He did it anyway. Maybe Machete Boy had gotten hold of another weapon and was up for another shot at killing the black man. He found a zone plan screwed to a wall at the next intersection, studied it, got a sense of how the area was laid out. The wall next to the map offered the deadpan graffitoed legend, "You are here, I'm afraid. Deal with it." He grinned despite himself and prowled back the way he'd come, aiming to start a proper search pattern, something to do until RIMSEC got there in force. He'd have to hope the lockdown worked. Behind him, the clank punt of a door disengaging its locks. He spun about, combat crouch in the making, when he saw the woman backing out of the open doorway. She wore nondescript coveralls, some logo he didn't recognize, and had her corkscrew unruly hair gathered up in a tight band, mestiza complexion, unlit spliff tucked into the corner of her mouth. By the time she'd fully turned, he was casual again. "Hey there." She appraised him with a head-to-foot look. "What's the matter? You lost?" "Next best thing." He built her a smile. "I'm supposed to meet some guy down here works for Dasky and Azul. Think either I've taken a wrong turn or he has. That right?" She was looking at the stigma jacket, he realized. Maybe the corporation and what it did wasn't standard knowledge out this far west, but unless you were immune to continental American news digests, it was hard to misunderstand the style of the jacket and the bright chevrons down the sleeve. He sighed. "Chasing a job, you know," he said, faking weariness. "Guy says he can maybe get me some hours." Another flickered assessment. She nodded and took the spliff out of her mouth, turned and gestured with it back to the corner with the map. "See that right turn there? Take that 2 blocks straight, then 1 left. Takes you through the bulkhead to starboard loading. Think Daskeen got a couple of berths there. You're not far out. Probably just got the wrong stairwell down off Margarita Thoroughfare." "Right." He let the renewed pulsing of the mesh leak through as eagerness. "Hey, thanks a lot." "No problem. Here." She handed him the spliff. "You get the work? Celebrate on me." "Oh, hey, you don't have to do—" "Take it, man." She held it out until he did. "Think I've never been where you are now?" "Thanks." "Thank you. Look, I better—" "Sure. Don't want to be late for your job interview." He grinned and nodded, wheeled about and stalked rapidly back to the corner. As soon as he rounded it, he broke into a flat run. "Who is this?" "This is Guava Diamond. We are blown, Claw Control. Repeat, we are blown. Heaven sent is endangered at best, fully exposed at worst. I don't know what the fuck you're playing at over there, but this is out of nowhere. We have no cover and no exit strategy, I can guarantee. Request immediate extraction." The bulkhead was a lustrous nanofiber black, raw and shiny and as distinct from the grey walls of the residential section as his Hilton-bought shirt was from the inmate jacket he wore over it. Bright yellow markings delineated the access hatches. By the look of it, they could be simply coded shut at a molecular level, hinges and locks turning to an unbroken hole with the surface of the hatch. He passed through, stabbed suddenly with memories of Mars. It hit him that ever since he'd gotten down from the shopping levels, that was what this place brought to mind. Life on Mars. Right down to the camaraderie of the helpful mestiza, the freely offered spliff. "Don't think you're going to miss all this," Sutherland had grinned at him, "but you will, Soak. You wait and see." Beyond lay starboard loading. He'd been on factory rafts a few times before this, but it was always easy to forget the scale of the things. Looking over the rail of the gantry he'd stepped onto was like viewing some immense factory testing rank for cable cars. The loading space was a 50-metre slope up from the ocean, and a vast roof of the same nanofibre construction as the bulkhead, vaulted so high overhead it could almost have been the night sky. Cut into this base, a dozen or more cable-crank slipways led up out of the water to the undersides of the perched docking sheds they served. The nanofibre cables shone in their channels like roped licorice, new and wet-looking in the overhead blast of LCLS arcs. Poised at various points between the underbelly entrances of the sheds and the sea, heavy-duty cradles held a variety of seagoing vessels secure on their respective slipways. Latticed steel gantries and stairs ran up and down the sides of the slips for maintenance and clung to the outer edges of the dock facilities above. Cranes and pylons bristled off the sloping surface. Dotted figures scrambled about, and faint yells lofted back and forth across the cavern-cold air. Carl scanned the roofing of the sheds for the Daskin Azul logo, found it on the 6th unit in line, and started to run. "Guava Diamond?" "Still holding." "We are unable to assist, Guava Diamond. Repeat, we are unable to assist. Suggest—" "You what? You bonobo-sucking piece of shit! You better tell me I misheard that." "There are control complications at this end. We cannot act. I'm sorry, Guava Diamond. You're on your own. You will be fucking sorry if we make it out of this in one piece. I repeat, Guava Diamond, we cannot act. Suggest you implement Lizard immediately, and get off Bulgakov's cat while you can. You may still have time. Pause. You're a fucking dead man, Claw Control. Static hiss. Carl was almost to the Daskin Azul unit when the crank cables leading up to it whined into sudden life. Shifting highlights on the nanofiber black in its recessed channel, it looked more like something melting and running than actual motion. He heard the change in engine note as the cables engaged a load. Somewhere down the line, a cradled mini-sub jerked and started to climb. Here we go. He was still at the initial access level he'd come in on, behind and 3 meters above the roofing of the line of docking sheds. Long, shallow sets of steps ran out from the walkway he stood on, sank between the units, and joined with a lower-level gantry that fringed each shed. He made it for the access level to the doors and hatches leading inside the facilities. Below again, further sets of steps sneaked down on themselves and connected to the slope the slipways were built into. There were hatches set into the roof of the Daskin Azul unit, but they were very likely sealed from the inside, and even if they weren't, going in that way was a good recipe for getting shot in the arse. Carl slowed to a crouched jog, made the corner of the shed and started down the flight of stairs at its side. The murmur of the winch engine came through the wall at his ear. A couple of small windows broke the corrugated alloy surface, and there was a closed door at the bottom of the stairs, no easy way in. He paused and weighed the options. He had no weapon, and no sense of the layout within the unit. No idea how many Daskin Azul employees he might be up against, or what they'd be armed with. Yeah, so this is where you back off and wait for Ravio's cavalry. But he already knew he wasn't going to do that. He crept under one of the windows and eased his head up beside it, grabbing a narrow-angled view into the space on the other side of the wall. Cleanly kept flooring, stacked dinghy hulls and other less identifiable hardware, LCLS panels shedding light from the walls and ceiling. The squat bulk of the winch machinery at the head of the slipway, and 4 gathered figures. He narrowed his eyes. The glass was filthy, and the winch system blocked a lot of the room's light. The 4 were all wearing Daskin Azul jackets, and the face he could see clearly was a stranger. A man. But the profile of the figure next to him was Machete Boy, gesticulating frantically at a woman whom Carl identified as Carmen Wren by poise and stance before he made out her face. She had a phone in her hand, held low, not in use. The 4th figure, his back turned to the window, had long hair gathered into a loose tail that hung below the collar of his jacket. Carl stared at him, and a solid slab of something dropped into his chest. He didn't need to see the face. He'd watched the same figure walk away from him in the mind's eye of the Hawkins Pride N Gin, along the deadened quiet of the spacecraft's corridors. Had seen him stop and turn and look up at the camera, look through it, as if he knew that Carl was there. He looked around now, as if called. Carl jerked his head back, but not before he'd seen the gaunt features, a little more flesh on the bones now, maybe, but still the same slash-cheeked, hollow-eyed stare. He was checking the door, twitched around on some whisper of intuition from the weight of Carl's gaze. Alan Merrin. Home from Mars. Carl sank back to the step, fuming. With the Haag gun, Ravio's gun, any fucking gun, he would have just stormed through the door and gotten it over with. Merrin's mesh and 13 instincts, Carmen Wren's combat poise, the unknown quantity that the other Daskin Azul employee represented, any weapons the 4 of them might have, it wouldn't matter. He'd fill the air with slugs going in, looking for multiple body hits, clean up the mess after. Unarmed, he was going to end up dead. "Where the fuck are you, Rimsek?" Ravio's words rinsed back through his mind. Alcatraz can authorize a block on traffic in and out. Might have to get a couple of people out of bed to do it, but nothing. Merrin and his pals here are going to bail out before Rimsek's dozy fucking authorities get the sleep out of their eyes. The cradled sub came on up the slipway. and stopped. Carl peered down through the steel lattice of the gantry he stood on. The hall cradle was still a good 20 meters down the slope, frozen there. Inside the docking shed, the winding engine ran on, but its sound had shifted. The licorice black of the cable was frozen in its channel. The winch had disconnected. He peered across the sweep of the loading slope and saw the same story all the way along. No motion. None of the cables was working. Lockdown. He'd done Rimsek an injustice. He saw it coming, just ahead of time. Moved off the wall, shifted stance for the combat crouch, and then the door ahead clanked open 3 steps down. The mesh pounded inside him. Wren came out, the others crowding behind. "Yank the cradle releases and ride it down. There's no other—" She saw him. He jumped. Their numbers made it work for him. He cannoned into Wren, knocked her flying back along the walkway and to the floor. Machete Boy roared and swung at him, hopelessly wide. Carl blocked, locked up an elbow and shoved the boy back into the 2 other men behind him. All 3 staggered back through the confines of the doorway. The nameless Daskin Azul employee yelped and brandished a weapon awkwardly, one-handed, yelling, "Get out of the way! Get out of the fucking way!" Carl made it as a shark punch, and his flesh quailed. He rode the attack momentum through the door, sent them all stumbling. He got his hands on the gunman's arm and wrenched, forced him to the floor, following him down, knee into the stomach. Found the pressure point in the wrist, wrenched again. The shark punch went off once, symphony of dull, metallic plinks and clanks as the murderous load punched ragged holes in the roof. Then he had possession, and the former owner was flailing under him disarmed. Carl twisted, pointed down point blank, and pulled the trigger. The other man turned abruptly to shredded bone and flesh from the waist up. Blood and gore splattered, drenched him from head to foot.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.